Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining session 4 of the Future Founders program run by Open UK. My name's Matthew Barker. I'm entrepreneur in residence at Open UK, and for those of you that don't know, we're the UK organization for open technology, which covers open source, open hardware, and open data. And our purpose is UK leadership and international collaboration in open technology. So this is a session today we're going to cover on sales in open source businesses. And what we're trying to achieve with these sessions, if you've not been to one before, is try to give people an insight into what it's like to run and sort of create value in open source businesses and how it might differ from proprietary or other types of businesses that you've worked in. And what we're trying to do is help people to come away from the session with understanding what the difference is between selling product in open source versus proprietary world, maybe what they need to do in order to be successful in selling open source products, and then some of the issues that they might be able to avoid. We're running a mentorship program in parallel, so if anyone is looking to start an open source business, then please do go to openuk.uk/founders forum, sign up there, and I can give you the benefit of my experience in building and running an open source company, and also introduce you to people that might be able to help around your particular areas of interest or need. So today we have 3 fantastic panelists. Welcome to you all. To begin with, we have Wright. Lee is the regional sales director of Confluent, which is the people behind Apache Kafka. So he runs UK and Ireland enterprise and public sector team. That team is responsible for driving new business and managing and growing relationships with existing clients. And Lee lives and works in London. And prior to joining Confluent, was one of the first hires at Elastic in the UK. Someone that I've known a long time and really respect his opinion on sales in open source businesses. So welcome, Lee. We have Paul Holt. Paul has spent the last 25 years, if I read that right, building and leading sales and marketing organizations, go-to-market business models associated with open source technology and subscription business models. He was with companies such as Red Hat, Canonical, SpringSource, and VeriSign, and he has first-hand experience in understanding what it takes to win customers and what it takes to keep customers in open source world. Welcome, Paul. And then finally, we have Victor Tuson Palau, who is actually probably not actually from the sales side. It's quite unique. We have someone representing the customer here, so thanks for that, Victor. He's the CTO at eBury, which is a financial services company based in London. He joined there in September 2018, and his background lies in engineering. He has over 20 years experience in the sector and has previous experience in managing international teams, developing operating systems and applications for both mobile and cloud solutions. He previously worked as a director of engineering at Bitnami and as a VP of commercial engineering at Canonical and Ubuntu, so he's actually seen both sides of the fence. Welcome, Victor. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So what I'd like to do as we start to go into the topic around sales in open source businesses, and I will say, if anyone has any questions, please send them on the chat or directly to me in the background. I'd like to start just by going around the panelists and talking a little bit about how you actually got into open source, because I know for a lot of the potential founders I've been speaking to, it's not always easy to work out how to get into this world. Paul, can I start with you, and can you let us know a little bit about how you got into this space?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So I think, and probably not unique to many people, I kind of fell into open source just really by accident. My first open source experience was with Red Hat in the early 2000s, when the open source world was really still trying to work out and understand how it made money. And I joined as an individual contributor. I joined as a sales guy into an organization at the time, which was 300 or 400 people. It had a small organization based in Guildford. And my job specifically was to sell distributions of Linux which were targeted for specific chipsets. Imagine that. So I spent a lot of time working with semiconductor manufacturers, in essence, trying to sell them a bespoke version of Linux. And I'm sure, as Lee will probably attest to as well, I spent the first 8 weeks after joining really thinking, what have I done? I joined a company that essentially gives its software away for free. as a sales guy, that's a really interesting proposition to actually get your head around, and try and convince both your friends and family that it was a good decision. But subsequently, I've never looked back, and never regretted it in one way, shape, or form. But in summary, I guess I fell into it. I fell into it by accident, and certainly in those days, it was probably harder to fall into it than it would be now, where I think it pretty much is pretty easy to end up at an open source company and understand why you're there.
Were you already in tech sales before
I
that?
was, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd done a few tech sales roles up until that, and ended up at Red Hat. Loved the logo, thought it looked pretty cool. Heard about Linux. It sounded quite interesting. So took a punt and as I say, really fell into it and never looked back.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. Lee, can you talk to us a bit about how you got into open source?
Yeah, didn't really know what I wanted to do when I graduated uni. Put a CV online, and a fabulous company called Software AG sent me a note saying, "Hey, would you like to come and do software sales?" There was a sort of recruitment process and assessment process, but as part of the sweetener, they said they'd fly us to California for 6 weeks to teach us about computers. Well, 21-year-old me went, yes, please. So got the job, went out, and from day one, loved the mission of open source. So they'd acquired a company called Terracotta, which was behind a project called Cache. And the premise of it was basically alleviating the pain of Oracle databases. I was there for some time. I went to a company called Couchbase after that, then Elasticsearch, and then finally Confluent. So 4 open source companies, and in every single one of them, in some variation, it's about alleviating the pain of having data in Oracle or IBM, because you don't have flexibility of access and you can't control the system. What drew me in was, if someone had a problem, they could work collaboratively with the vendor to solve it. The first pull request I actually saw at Couchbase to change the platform live when someone had a challenge that was actually coming from the customer meant, for me, open source all the way. And 10 years later, I still, having had many phone calls from proprietary companies, don't believe there's a better way. And my favorite saying came from one of the core engineers of Elastic. He said, "You can't out-engineer open source." And it's just so true.
Yeah, you're right. You're definitely, in telling that story, reminding me of a couple of points of my career, like being 21-year-old joining Canonical and asking what a server was. I remember that pretty distinctly. But I'd obviously heard about open source because at university I was doing a business course and learning about change, complexity, and innovation. And I remember being shown an early picture of a Linux user group and being told that a group of people on the internet had built an operating system that you could install in replacement for Microsoft Windows. And I could not believe that existed and people would actually dedicate their time to doing it. So when I got the call from a recruiter talking about what Canonical was, like, that was something I was just so interested and fascinated by that concept that's what kind of pulled me in. But I think the same as you and Paul, it was somewhat by accident. And am I right in thinking that Terracotta is what Oracle tried to defend themselves against with Exadata, or is that something?
Coherence.
Coherence, coherence.
Yes.
Which interesting. Thanks, Lee. Victor, over to you. How did you get into open source?
I mean, so I guess coming from a technology background at university, and personally tinker a lot with different open source projects, so especially kind of Linux distros and stuff like that. But it wasn't really as a way of like working. When I was running a team that did developer tools at Nokia. So we did the internal developer tools for Symbian OS at the time for the Nokia system. And we used a framework called Eclipse, which is a fairly good, healthy community for IDs. Back on the days, I think they're still strong. And we started, I guess, like mentioned before, we started contributing to it because that was the better way to engage with the community and to kind of get what we needed out of it, right? And that kind of it was quite powerful to, we got people into projects and being core contributors to parts of the idea, especially like the C++ part. That's what kind of was driving Symbian at the time, right? And that was, to me, it was kind of eye-opening that we could engage with software which wasn't licensed, but we could engage and change it from within and make it fit what we needed, right? To then serve for developers. And then soon after that, then I had the opportunity to join the effort to make a Symbian an open source system, and that was a lot of fun. And funny enough, kind of looked at how we wanted to do that. So we copy a lot of the ways of working of Ubuntu, which led me to Canonical, and and so on and so forth. But it was sort of, I guess, following that user engagement or the ability to make really solutions out of open source software that attract me. Right? And as you said, kind of being both sides of the fence. Canonical was building all the integrations and the kind of the commercial products with Ubuntu that we were doing, that with kind of computers, servers, mobile phones, a bit of everything.
That's great.
Really consuming it. That's the main thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'd probably like to start with you, Victor, if I could, with a question, and that is, obviously we all work we've all worked, some of us act proactively in open source software vendors that have very successful open source projects behind them. How is it when you're like, as a CTO in your company, how is it that you think about adopting open source like software? Do you make the decision? Does your team make the decision? Like, are you a gatekeeper for that? Can you just talk to me a bit about how new open source projects get adopted inside?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is kind of specific to my company, but I think kind of it's probably across most companies that we have a framework to control software choices, but it's not necessarily. So the decision or the sponsoring always comes from someone that is doing the job, right? And 99% of the times, developers choose open source because they can tinker with it, because they can see it, and they can get to it and do some proof of concepts, right? And then the rest of the effort is to get it through the selection process, right? So for us, when we look at it, open source per se is not something we shy away from. In fact, we kind of think that it's got a lot of advantages, but then there's a lot of questions behind, what's the community behind it? What's the support like? Who's going to support it? Can we become contributors, right? Not all projects are open to that. So it's kind of the process behind it that I see more as a gatekeeper than choosing.
Okay. So you're relatively comfortable if a developer is picking up a piece of open source software to fulfill a particular requirement, but you're sitting sort of slightly above that and just sort of piecing together a bit of a picture on what that project looks like and whether that's something that will be able to graduate to production within the business.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that, right? So they have to meet certain quality bar to graduate that project into production.
And you talked about open source holding an advantage for you in your business. Like, can you just
So I think especially for like in this forum, not for startups, right? Ebury is not a small company, it's not a large enterprise, but we are very much regulated. So we are a financial service company that we're regulated in Europe, in the UK, in Singapore, in Australia, in many different countries where we often offer financial services. So from that point of view, we have similar requirements to a larger enterprise, right? And for us, one of it is business continuity, right? So we put something in production, it has to stay in production and has a plan in case it goes wrong. Working with a smaller company is always the doubt of what happens if that company is not there anymore or gets acquired and there's a change of direction, the pivot, what do we do? No? It's not a complete blocker, but for real production software, open source gives us peace of mind that we don't have to talk about set up an escrow or something like that. What will happen with the code, right? So it can be 5 or 10 people behind it, but it's open source and it has engagement from a community. Then we know that that's a continuity plan, which is either ourselves or another service provider that can pick it up, right? So it takes a lot of the worries in terms of doing the due diligence on the company. So
it's actually less, in some ways, strangely, it's less of a risk than engaging with a smaller proprietary company in that regard. Yeah. And thanks for that, Victor. So just coming on to maybe on the vendor side, you've heard there from Victor how open source gets adopted inside his company. How do you, as a salesperson, actually identify the people that are adopting that software? And how do you go about targeting those? Because as far as I'm aware, and it might be different in your respective businesses, but a lot of open source software doesn't you can't track where that usage is. Paul, do you want to just maybe just talk a little bit about how you go about finding the people that are using your, the project that you represent?
Yeah, no, I think that's it's a challenging question, and I guess you need to look at it in two ways, or I always have tried to look at it in two ways, which is firstly identifying the people who and organizations which are using your software. That's the initial challenge. And then as a commercial side of the business, you also need to identify the people who are not only using your software, but then will be prepared to pay for it, because they're not necessarily one and the same, which is fine. I mean, that's one of the joys of open source. So, as I've built the sales organizations, it's really key that you consider that as you build that go-to-market machine. Okay, I'm going to try and understand who's using my technology and why, and then actually on top of that, I'm going to try and understand within that group of individuals and group of organizations who are those who are actually going to pay for it. And I think that really comes down to really understanding fundamentally what is it that you are delivering in terms of value. What's the value proposition that you are actually taking to market, and who does that resonate with? And I guess that's no different from what a proprietary organization would actually go through in terms of understanding what their product market fit is, what their target market is, who are their target personas that they would actually be selling, that they would be actually selling to. So, at the very, 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 very ground level, really it's understanding and engaging with the community, looking at who's playing within your community, looking at the organizations that are playing with playing with the technology, really understanding what's going on from the ground up. And then pretty quickly, you can start to understand what are the types of organizations that are actually using your technology, and whereabouts, and who, and all of those types of things. And I think this is a real advantage that you do have from a from a proprietary company, is that you have the luxury of understanding who's engaging with your technology, whereas from a proprietary perspective, you don't have that luxury. You don't have that luxury. But it is a bottom-up go-to-market model as opposed to a top-down. You are engaging with developers. You are engaging with people who understand more often much more about the technology than you do. Which is that's probably one of the challenges. But to me, it's always been a very rewarding model if you can get the engagement going well with those types of those types of communities. So understanding your community, who are using the technology, and then really understanding the value and being able to identify the organizations that will be prepared to pay for it. That's the key challenges I see.
Yeah, I definitely resonate, having been in open source sales for virtually my entire career, how much nicer it is to have at least an understanding of who's using your software. Being a salesperson in a proprietary organization, just trying to beat down the doors through multiple LinkedIn messages or phone calls, and just trying to sell almost from a standing start would be very difficult. And that's probably one of the reasons why that's definitely kept me in the open source world, because that feeling of a sense of connection to users, maybe not just like possible customers, but also they're going to help you guide maybe around what's of use to them, and that's going to help obviously inform the the product feature set, as well as just sort of helping to purely with further adoption of the project. You mentioned engaging with the community there. Lee, do you spend a lot of time with your communities and trying and using that as a way to try and find potential customers, or are there any other tips and tricks that you use to try and find project users who might be able to become customers?
So when you're looking for customers or looking to generate revenue in any way, you effectively have three levers that you can actually apply. So the first is to create net new users, right? The second is to convert your existing users, and the final one is to expand your existing customer base who are paying some variation of either a self-managed or fully managed version of your open source project. When you're talking about the convert play, right, it is absolutely critical that you are a partner to your open source users. If you aren't thinking that whether they pay you or not, you want them to be successful with your software, you have missed a trick. And providing them resources, both as an individual level and at a company level, to help provide thought leadership, helping upgrade security patches to the open source project, it won't be successful without it, and you'll have no community that you can then go forward and convert. The way in which there are only 3 ways which you can actually convert an open source user who is live and successful, but you can never convert one that isn't successful. So they're in production and they have an unfortunate incident. If you're there and you've added value and you've proven yourself a thought leader and that you can be a partner, if there is a business critical need, they will then come to you to look to take either licensed software or fully managed software to relieve the pain that any kind of outage or challenge that's been led by running software. It's software, it goes wrong. Both proprietary and open source do as well. The second piece is there's been churn in the customer's personnel, right? I always describe it as whose baby is it? Who gets woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning that knows where all the secrets are inside the implementation of this platform? If that person leaves, you as an organization have so much institutional knowledge from working with that person for years, even if they haven't paid, you can then help with that business continuity that was mentioned earlier. And the final is if there's been a wholesale change to the way that software needs to be operationalized. Is it moving from on-prem to the cloud? Does there need to be a change in security posture? So they'll need potentially the enterprise version of the platform. Is there a desire to move to Kubernetes, improve monitoring? All of these are enterprise features, but they get driven across all of the operational capabilities, not just for this one open source project that companies will be running.
Interesting. You've obviously, Victor, you've heard a little bit of what these guys got to say. What's the best way of getting in contact with you? If you've got an engineer who's testing out a new open source project, would you even entertain a conversation with the vendor behind it at this point, or would you need to see more before you actually, responded to that LinkedIn message or whatever it was?
Yeah, I'd probably like to see a bit more, right? But definitely before going into production, we will want to have a conversation on how we're gonna support it, or what's the operation management of that piece of software or infrastructure, right? So not everything is the same thing. It's not the same thing like when we move to Kubernetes or Kafka or something like that, which is key infrastructure for most applications that are adopting it, versus maybe a tool that is helping with some of the monitoring or something like that, right? So in those cases, if it's a fundamental piece of the infrastructure, we will do some proof of concepts, and we'll be looking to engage with the company behind that project or the community at that point, and not wait until it's in production. Right?
So it sounds like it's a combination of the relative importance of like the software itself and how impactful that is on the business, combined with timing, which means like probably a moment you think to yourself, I'm probably going to get to production with this. I'm going to need to start now talking to people who can help us with that.
Exactly. I think it's something auxiliary. The important thing is kind of not to get in the way of adoption, right? So I think something I've seen is that some business models or enterprise versus free feature can get on the way of adoption, right? Because there's some features that stops you from putting it in production, and you probably want to encourage that. And as Lee was saying, then there are kind of other points of converting that to revenue. If it's a key part of the infrastructure, you want to have the conversation as you are adopting it and before you go into production, and want like a partner there.
Yeah.
To the process of moving there, right? Because it's important there is no kind of false steps when you do that. So it's kind of really depends on what sort of software you are developing.
Back in the early days of AWS, back in the early days of AWS, I remember hearing all you needed is a techie and a credit card to sort of get started in Amazon. Do you ever get to the point where like a developer's already bought software?
No, I think that's not the case, right?
Okay.
I mean, it depends, right? So I think we were discussing this on the pre-call. That I'm talking about my size of companies, right? I think for startups, like for example, when I was working at Dynamic, probably it's kind of like the most recent startup, definitely the case.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That was definitely the case. at larger companies, that's not the case because, access to who can buy your Amazon account is already quite restricted.
Yeah.
Right?
Sorry, Paul, you were going to...
No, I was just going to just touch on Victor's point there, because I think he makes a really, really valid point there in terms of, in my experience, the propensity for a customer to pay you money really depends on the criticality of what you're offering. So the closer you can get to production, the closer you can align yourself to security, the closer you can get to productivity or driving more, profitability for the company you're selling to through your enterprise offering, the greater the propensity is that people will pay you over and above the open source offering, which you might have. I remember in my early days at SpringSource, that was hard. That was a hard sell because you were in the developer stack. You were trying to convince people, really early in the software development lifecycle that it was worthwhile spending money on, the enterprise offering. That perhaps was very, very different from, one of my most recent experiences at Anchor, which was really about the security of the Kubernetes, the software containers that you're putting into production. That inherently is a much more risky proposition for a customer to use a completely open source solution around. Very, very, very different types of conversations. So I think you just, going back to the opening point, was that you just really have to understand what is the value that you can bring. If you can get close to operations, you can get close to security, you can get closer to driving more productivity. That's an easier conversation to have.
Absolutely. Lee, you've mainly worked for open source database companies, so I guess you've been quite blessed in that perspective. Anything to comment or add on that?
It was, again, a piece of advice I received early on in my career, that the most important thing you can be to a business is those who control the data. It's the most valuable piece you can bring to an organization. I think when we're talking about criticality and how things have progressed, the move to managed services and offering software as a SaaS from an open source perspective has completely changed the commercial dynamics between open source vendors and customers. I took an interview with Databricks Spark 4-5 years ago when they were absolutely tiny. And they told me, we only provide hosted Spark. We will not support anything on-prem. And I sat there and thought, well, you're missing out on everything public sector, you're missing out on everything in high-end financial services, and this is going to be a massive miss. And 5 years later, they were 100% right, and every open source company is now refocusing and doubling their efforts down to be a managed service provider of their open source project. Atlas is the future of Mongo, Confluent Cloud, the future of Confluent. And so it was really incredible to see their vision on that front. And it's been incredible over the last 10 years to see the absolute shift from nothing managed when I started to at least 50% plus now in the enterprise space.
That's great. Some great points there. Thanks. And I definitely want us to at some point explore that on-premise to cloud consumption of the software. Before I do that, Victor, can I just come back to you and talk a little bit about the actual initial purchase of maybe a newer, because obviously in this case we're appealing to founders who are probably just getting started with their open source projects, of like what constitutes enough value in either a feature or a service around the open source that would actually compel you to buy in those early days. Because I mean, I've worked mainly at startups around open source software projects, and in the early days, more often than not, it's just support. I mean, there's not even any features to sell at that point. Like, would you just buy support for an open source project, or do you feel like you have to have some value add features, or maybe even clauses in contracts that might give you some peace of mind around either IP infringement or liabilities and so on? What is it that kind of you feel like you need as a bare minimum?
So I'm guessing you mean bare minimum to pay, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think support is fine as a starting point, right? The bare minimum I need is value, right? So I think it goes back to what Paul was saying. So again, it depends, right? But overall, I think that the trick is to get to a point where the value and reliance is already established by adoption. And then it gets to a point of what I was mentioning, our business continuity, where we cannot afford not to buy support, right? So, and then additional features could be also around security or additional product features that have real value, right? But almost there is one sort of easy approach, which is if it's widely adopted, I need to buy some insurance for it, right? As a CTO, and that could be either support or security features or enterprise version that makes it more hardened, right? But this starts by, is it widely adopted, right? So already within the team, right? That's one area, and then the other one, I guess, is more what I mentioned before, which is the product itself has a value and you're willing to pay for it. It's just, am I more likely to buy it because it's open source? And at that point, probably the answer is yes, also depending on the licensing around the open source. So if it's a well-known license that is kind of friendly, I mean, I think other people are much more, like Amanda, much more suited to talk about that. No, but I think kind of the worst thing you can do is pick the wrong license there. That can put people off. But there's so many good friendly licenses for adoption that just focus on that. But at that point, I think I would probably buy the products either way. It's just that if it's open source, as we mentioned before, it takes a bit more of the risk of what happens if the company changes or decides to gets acquired or decides to change direction, right?
And do you almost always go to the vendor themselves, or do you sometimes work with service providers?
No, so we do go to service providers also and partners, and more often than not, and this is sort of a pitfall that we're discussing with you before. It's also the cloud providers themselves adopt open source solutions and offer hosted solutions, and quite often we go with them, right? So for example, Aldas, for us, it would be, if we were all in on Mongo, we'll probably choose Aldas, but we basically have a few instances. So we normally go for like DocumentDB or something like that from Amazon, just because it's not widely adopted. We're more like a SQL house. So we'll focus on something that is easy barrier to adoption from a software provider point of view.
So Lee and Paul, I think Victor might have given you a few hints there, but let's say you've identified a company, you've seen that the engineering team has adopted the open source project. It looks like it might be getting to the stage where they're getting close to production, and you actually bag a meeting with the man himself, Victor. How do you go into that meeting and sell value around your open source project, and what do you tend to focus on in those early meetings, and what does a sales process look like once you actually get that opportunity? I don't know if either of you can take that on if you'd like.
I'll take it first. I'm sure Lee's got some perspective on that. Hey, well, firstly, I would say actually I would approach it no different from whether it's open source or not. It's academic. It's just good sales practice, and whether you're selling a proprietary product or an open source product, some of the questions which I would always challenge my team to ask themselves before they go into that is things along the lines of what does success look like for Victor? What is Victor going to be sitting there thinking about in terms of what do I want to get out of this meeting? And that to me is just some of the very important questions that you've got to have at the back of your mind as you start thinking about, okay, how am I going to position this? And actually, is this a good fit? Because again, not all opportunities. So one of the beauties I enjoy about open source is you really have, as a salesperson, you have to really understand the value that you're bringing over and above the open source project. You have to really be able to understand and articulate that to your prospects. And if you can't do that, then you will fall at the first hurdle. And hopefully there's alignment between the value proposition that you have within your enterprise product and actually what good looks like for Victor. And then you're gonna come out with some sort of successful conclusion. And then it's just good sales methodology. No different, I would say. No different between proprietary and open source. I would go as far to say is that a lot of customers, a lot of prospects that we deal with nowadays, they don't really care whether the technology is open source or not. What they really care about is how easy is it to get into a technology and adopt a technology, and perhaps even more importantly, how easy is it to get off and dumper technology. It's all, boil it down to simple Porter's 5 forces about, competitive markets. How easy and how costly is it to adopt, and how easy and how costly is it to get off? I think, if you really just have a very, very, just simple conversation with yourself around your value proposition and how you structure things, you'll end up with a fairly compelling conversation, or not, as the case may be.
But it sounds like there might be some nuances with open source as to how you identify and actually target these potential customers and actually how you get in the door. But when it comes to sales process itself, it's relatively similar.
Exactly.
And Lee, do you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. The biggest mistake I see from salespeople in open source over and over again is just because they use the open source project at scale for mission critical use cases does not mean they are going to be a customer. There has to be alignment between both the value add, but also a desire for a partnership between the user and the vendor. So, what is the thought leadership and vision that you as an open source entity are proposing? Elasticsearch solves a certain problem, but there's also a vision moving into the future. Kafka can take data from A to B, but actually you can then build an entire microservices and ecosystem that can fundamentally change these organizations, and helping them in the maturity through adopting these technologies isn't about solving, okay, you're using the open source project today, can you please pay me? But actually, what do you as a business want to achieve over the next 12, 24 months and beyond? And we can show and demonstrate how we can help you in that journey, both through IP, professional services, and then de-risk it through support. Mm-hmm. And aligning that directly is the only way to prove evidence, whereas the mistake you just see again and again is, hey, we want to talk to you because you're using our open source project, therefore you should be a customer.
But there, inherent in that lies a very difficult problem. It's kind of where I was coming back to at the beginning of this panel, is that in some cases, these projects can get downloaded millions of times a day, and you could have tens of thousands, if not millions of users. So what percentage do you tend to see of people actually using the project by your value add solutions? Do you have a rough idea on what that ends up being?
If Confluent could be 10%, we'd be a phenomenal company, right? I'm serious. MySQL was something like 1% of users when it got acquired by Oracle, massively ahead of their time, right? The goal is not, if your goal is to monetize 100% of your open source user base, you've already failed. Mm-hmm. That cannot and never should be the goal. It's about driving value in the segment of the market and the type of organization that's going to acquire, right?
Paul, you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would absolutely. I think, I'm sure you've probably had these conversations in previous sessions, Matt, but one of the things that I often find interesting, it's particularly in the early stage open source companies, is why are we open source? From a business perspective, why are we open source? And to me, there's a few reasons why you'd want to be open source. It's either trying to leverage the power of the community to help you with development efforts. It's you want to get the technology out there and make it a ubiquitous solution which people ultimately use and drive adoption. I think they're probably the two main reasons why you'd want to be an open source. You'd want to be an open source company, and if it's the latter, if it's about driving adoption, it's about driving ubiquity. That's a huge advantage that you have when you think about a business model and really identifying customers, because you're going to people who've already adopted your technology. They already understand your technology. They know what it's like. They like it. And more often than not, they want to talk to you about it. That's a huge advantage that you have over proprietary companies. It's also potentially a disadvantage because they may not also be the same people who actually want to pay you for it. So it could be a big distraction. So to me, it goes back to that same point. You've got to understand your value proposition. You've got to understand why people are going to pay you money. You've got to qualify hard and early, and think, is this person that's going to pay me some money, and if they're not, that's great. Move on. Thank you for being part of the community. We love the fact you're using our technology. If you ever want to use the enterprise version, please talk to us. But but move on. I think you also have to be prepared to, again, big difference between the proprietary space and the open source space. You have to be comfortable with starting small. You have to be comfortable to understand that actually it isn't going to be a wholesale adoption. It will be a few projects here and there. And that really it's about longevity and building that relationship. And Lee, I think you made the spot on point. It's not just about features, and it's about relationship. It's about a relationship with a vendor that you build over time, and it grows over time. I think one of the things I have learned in this game about open source is that it is deriving the value out of that relationship over the years to come. It's not about that first initial order that you get. As I think about some of the biggest customers I've had, probably started off with some of the smallest orders I've got. You take a 10 grand order, that turns into a million pound order, a few years later, and that certainly was, the experience that I had with Red Hat. So, it's a really interesting and challenging business model in that respect.
I think the open source as a community, I think you've both raised some great points that has obviously evolved over the past 5 to 10 years, because when I started in open source, a lot of the companies that I was speaking to and engaging with were using open source because that is just what they wanted to do. It was almost like a religious thing. And then I remember distinctly, like the early days at MongoDB, because I was very early salesperson there, and speaking to the founders. So what is it about open source? Is it because it's like something you truly deeply believe in? And one of the responses I got was, no, it's just a great distribution model. It was like, why should I even care? Like, it's just a great way to get software in lots of people's hands. And actually the success of some of those early open source companies meant that open source as a concept just grew in momentum. And now we're at the point where it would almost be strange to start a proprietary company, because open source now is the playing field in some ways. It's been really fascinating to see that change, I guess, in slight attitude to it. And I think open source might have been seen previously as like one of those quirky, weird things that you're going to have to sell your t-shirts and your hats, and in some cases cycling gear around to make your revenue. Whereas now it is just the distribution choice of distribution. Method of choice.
I'm a firm believer that if you solve a genuine problem and then you have the confidence in that technology to put it out there and make it freely available, you're gonna drive widespread adoption, and that's the great foundation on which to build a business.
But that in itself does lead to some challenges, and obviously one of those is how your competitors can take advantage of that and end up taking your open source software and possibly starting to sell against you. Victor, when it comes to sort of consuming open source software, how are you thinking about taking consuming open source software either as a service or on premise? And are you actually looking maybe at some of the cloud vendors' services of some of these open source vendors' solutions, or would you tend to sort of err towards going directly with the vendor themselves? What goes into your mind what goes through your mind when you're thinking about making that decision?
So it goes back about your question about the credit card, right? So it is hard, I think, for nowadays to buy just software with a credit card, and so as you were saying, for the developer, but it's easier to do that with a cloud solution from a vendor. So for example, we are AWS Shop. It's pretty easy for the developers to click a button and get kind of document DB I was referring before, or EKS deployed, versus looking for something outside. So I think that is a lower barrier to entry you have. One of the things I wanted to say, kind of also because I work at Bitnami, where we package open source solutions and made available through markets, right? Often these are solutions that already reach ubiquity, right? So I think there it's a question of then, well, you as a supplier or a sponsor of a project, you already reached a point to get AWS interested, then you really need to work hard to monetize that, because you're already in a very good position, right? So the problem is sometimes getting there, right, and trying to monetize on early adopters. So we often look at things that are already in ubiquity to get either through the supplier or the cloud. And when we look to new projects, I think one of the things is like how are we going to get monetized on that? And a lot of that is, well, kind of, we feel like we provide a lot of value to the project in terms of product feedback, maybe reference to other customers and so on. And you need to be careful not to try, if you go for a ubiquity, not to try to monetize too much too early on and actually never reach ubiquity because of that, right? So it's sort of where you draw the line. For us, hosted or not hosted solutions depends on what it is, whether it's a feature, computational feature, or whether it's data. So I think Lee was saying that kind of who controls it that has the power. So I think in terms of regulations and stuff like that, it's quite hard for us to move data around to any third parties, right? So we tend to look for self-hosted solutions for data related use cases. If it's functionality, like we have things like monitor our websites, our app and stuff like that, then definitely we're looking for hosted by a supplier. And at that point, it's probably less relevant if it's a cloud supplier or not. Yeah, that's kind of the main difference.
That's great. Thanks. Lee, you've got a bit of experience in sort of, working for companies where your projects have been offered by some of the cloud vendors. How have you found selling against some of those services?
I don't see any difference between AWS CS, or it's had to be renamed due to copyright infringement, and MSK. And I would have loved if Amazon had run as you said, if Amazon aren't running your open source project, are you a successful open source project? So there is no Couchbase being offered, to the best of my knowledge, by Amazon. But I don't view it any differently to someone running the open source project. It's still 100% an individual that we want to be successful, that we want to partner with, that we want to share information with. I vote with my feet. I truly believe in a best-in-breed version of these data products. And, I haven't picked a huge amount, right? Elastic and Confluent are the two organizations I've gone to, and that's because Shai Bannon and Jay Krebs have an absolute vision of what they see people can do with the projects that they steward. And so by voting my feet, joining Confluent, okay, be successful with MSK. And when you want to look at things like data lineage and true microservices and event-driven architectures, not just adopting it to solve a tactical solution, then we're here to help. And in the lead up to this, Victor was talking about, how much work it is to onboard you as a non-AWS or cloud provider supplier, right? And the absolute value has to be there to go through the pain, right? So I believe the value is there categorically, and it's working with my clients and helping them mature along the way until such time that they reach that critical mass where they move off of the Amazon hosted service to the vendor hosted service. And what always makes me laugh is, well, we're still hosting it on Amazon, so they win either way. And actually, we have a relationship manager who couldn't be more engaged, saying that they're encouraging Confluent Cloud as the default solution. And Amazon, I love them, genuinely believe as well in customer first. And so if MSK is the right solution for you, go with MSK. If Confluent Cloud is the right solution for you because of the genuine differentiator, and it's not one of 240 products we offer, it is what we do, and that's what you need, then we're here to support that.
Paul, you were selling open source technology before the cloud vendors existed. Is it harder, like post cloud, or was it is it easier?
No, I think the cloud is a great route to market, and the marketplaces that exist out there. If you've got a successful open source project and you can get it in the hands of people through those marketplaces, and perhaps more importantly, if they already have existing relationships with AWSs and the GCPs of this world, it's a great route to market. but naturally, we're in a competitive space, and if you start making decent money out of a product, it's only natural that other people are going to look and think, can I have a piece of this action as well? Whether it's the SaaS model or whether it's the product differentiation, I think it comes back to a core principle to me. And I think back to the early days at Red Hat, where we had an enterprise Linux offering, and I remember the week to this day where Oracle came out and said, actually, we've taken Red Hat Enterprise Linux and we just rebadged it, and it's now called Oracle Linux. And you can imagine, an organization of 700-800 people at the time, and an organization of probably tens of thousands at the time, with a relationship with every single enterprise company in the world. That was a huge competitive threat. But, again, and Lee makes the point, really well, is that if you understand the value proposition that you have, if you understand why people should be paying you money, and actually that is genuinely true, whether it be associated to the model, whether it traces to the technology, whether it the way that they consume it, it's academic. People will continue to want to have that relationship with you. They will continue to want to have that relationship with you. And the reason why Oracle weren't able to take Red Hat on there is because of at the time we were the stewards of the Linux kernel. We were the organization that had 7 of the top 10 developers within the Linux were on Red Hat's payroll, and people understood the importance of that, and we were able to articulate that. So again, whether you're competing with a SaaS-based model, etc., as long as you can understand why people should be paying you money, you should be in a defensible and a strong position.
Yeah, great points. Thanks. There's a fantastic question that's come through from Borna, which is, as open source companies scale, they seem to naturally move towards an open core model and build more proprietary features and functions to differentiate their offering from open source and other vendors. How do these growing companies continue to grow sales whilst not distancing themselves too much from the original project and community? And I can say for a fact that I've seen that happen in multiple companies that not multiple, but in companies I've worked for before. Does anyone have any comment on that?
That's a great question. Yeah, you've seen companies fail. You've seen people who have been too overprotective of their core, and you've been people too liberal with their core. And I can think of numerous examples. It's just a really tough one, and I think my advice would be just to continually step back and look at that fine line that you continue to tread between the community, the enterprise product set, and are you satisfying the needs of both, and does that continually support the business and the objectives of what you're trying to achieve? So I don't think there's a straightforward answer, to be honest. I think you just need to be.
But the sad thing is that you need a community early days to make your project successful, and then when you've created a successful product around it, do you really need the community anymore? And then do you run the risk of effectively losing the confidence of that underlying project? But do vendors even care at that point? That in itself is a little bit of an issue, I think.
They should care, right? I mean, I think ultimately the community is not just about buying. So another thing that is important for me is skills, right? So when I look at that technology, Kafka is a good example, right? Where it's and Kubernetes, where a complex technologies, not only looking about who am I buying it from and the support, but can I get enough people in my team that understand that technology, right? And the community is a great source of that, right? And if you kill the community, having worked at Symbian, right, where there was not enough, one of the great failures is there were not enough people that knew how to do stuff with Symbian, right? So, and that's sort of part of what killed the project, among other things, right? So I think it's the community is also important to create that awareness on the developers, and which is the user base, and maybe not your clients, right? So it's not that people are paying, but people are using it within the customers that you have, right? Need to learn one way. So like a company that does this really well, but it's not open source, will be Salesforce, right? Where they have a very good academy to train people and to develop a body of knowledge in the industry, right? And that's kind of areas where, it does come into mind when you're choosing a technology. I think what Paul was saying also, and staying with the technology, because what we look definitely we look at how is it to move out of this technology, and that can be a trigger point to start looking somewhere else, right, where it's becoming to get people.
I think that's a really great point. It's not just community in the sense of the GitHub community. It's also community in terms of ecosystem, like where you're, the third parties that are integrating your software, the knowledge and the training and the service providers around it, and that body of knowledge around it. I mean, something I always catch myself on this because I've spoken to a number of, probably more recently, Microsoft execs that have been there for 20, 30 years. And you think back to Bournemouth going on about developers. I've been told by them that some of the strongest community that they've ever seen has been in the Microsoft developer community in the 90s, and seeing the sort of pure love and passion for Microsoft as a platform then. So we shouldn't really just think about it in terms of a pure open source community, someone downloading and using and contributing to the software, and as an individual user we should be thinking about it probably a bit more widely than that. I think that's something that I reflect on as you talk there, Victor, about it. Lee, any comments from you on this?
Yeah, I've seen, it's probably one of the biggest mistakes I've seen the vendors I've worked for make, where you effectively have one screen on the website which basically says, this one is the open source technology, then this one is the free technology, but we restrict what the cloud provider can do, and then this one is the full proprietary. And there's a list of features, and when I started, because I started early and everywhere, it was about 6 features, and it was 2 ticks here, 3 ticks here, and 6 ticks there. Now, if you look at both, if you look at Elastic's website, it's insanity. It's literally like you have to keep scrolling and scrolling, I think 3 times to go through. And that's, again, no one is buying for that 1 tick, right? You're buying it to achieve an end goal for yourself as an organization. And having that feature creep of, okay, well, you can do certain type of security at this level, but then a different kind of security at this level, that's a horrible part of the sales process, and moves you away from value to feature function, which isn't where value is derived. What Confluent have done really well is basically group these things into developer, functional, and then operational tooling, and basically just calling them out in, we extend developer capabilities, operational capabilities, and functional capabilities, and then, by the way, all of this is a managed service. Rather than literally line by line by line by line. Yes, there's a difference, but you don't choose a car because of the heated seat. You pick the whole vehicle, and then great, it's got some extras.
It's about a total solution and value, maybe thinking about it that way. I think we're coming towards the end, but I just thank you for that question. Really, really good one.
Just a shout out to Borna. He's on my team, and he is a fantastic human being.
Okay, good. Thank you for that, Lee. It sounds like you're doing some great stuff there, Borna. So I'd just like to finish by just sort of going around the panelists and just asking them, if you're an open source software, either potential founder or early founder, you've got a project, what's the one piece of advice you can give them when it comes to the selling around open source software? Lee, can I start with you?
Focus on the customer. Focus on their needs, and what they are trying to achieve. We're looking to set up. Your initial customers will be very, very much partners, right? So it's collecting feedback from them, and you will always start with support, get to a managed service, and get to an enterprise-grade distribution as quickly as you can, and ship early, right, in MVP. All of these things are related to both, proprietary projects and open source. The big thing is, as we've said many times over, is focusing on the community, and really those early adopters are going to make you successful to then give you the launch pad to build a business off of.
Thanks, Lee. Holt?
I would say, well, firstly, congratulations. You've chosen probably what is the most challenging but rewarding business model that you could possibly embark on. But good on you, and I think it's it's the perfect business model. But I've said it many times, in the past hour, it would be just absolutely focus on asking yourself the question of why somebody would pay you money for what you're delivering, and believe it and deliver on it. And if it's true, you'll be successful.
Thanks, Paul. Victor?
So I'm gonna pick on something that Lee said before, which I think is key as a person buying it, which is trying to make everyone successful when you're trying to adopt it. Not think at that point on the monetization, because that will, there will be some people you need to monetize or not, but ultimately you think about what 1 to 10% of the community. You need a community in order to have that 10%, right? So build a successful community, and maybe that person won't be monetized, but they'll refer you to someone that they will, or eventually will move to another company where they will pay you or whatever you do. But like, you need to go into the aim of making every user successful and then making some of them into your customers.
Great point. I think we all know that the people who adopt this technology, the world is quite small, although it is growing quite rapidly. So yeah, definitely take advantage of making everyone successful, and I think that sort of word of mouth will definitely spread and help. Thank you so much to all the panelists for joining. I've really enjoyed this discussion. Next week, we're going to be talking about business and revenue models, which is obviously very connected to the discussion we had today with Liz Rice, Ivan's Lorna Mitchell, VMware's Dawn Foster, and the lady herself, Open UK CEO Amanda Brock. Have a great Friday afternoon, everybody. Great weekend, and I'll see you next week.